Imagine this. A conflict so enormous it spanned from Alaska's frozen wilderness to the Pacific's sweltering tropical forests. Countless American troops deployed to destinations they couldn't even locate before the conflict began. Now here's what's mind-blowing. Upon arrival, there was nothing waiting. No barracks, no structures, not even basic shelter overhead. Just endless mud, relentless rainfall, and nature's fury pounding down. So what did the U.S. military do? They didn't transport lumber across half the planet. They didn't waste precious time constructing elaborate facilities. They created one of the most unusual yet remarkably effective solutions you've likely never considered: the Quonset Hut. A curved, corrugated steel semicircle that could appear anywhere, instantly, keeping soldiers alive. And here's a statistic that'll blow your mind. Over 100,000 of these structures were manufactured during World War II. That's not an error. That's an industrial torrent of steel and determination transformed into living quarters, medical facilities, command headquarters, and even places of worship. Picture arriving on a remote Pacific island in 1943 and witnessing one of these buildings emerge from bare ground in a single day, ready to shelter dozens of troops. It sounds almost like fantasy, but it was absolutely real. Here's what's shocking. These structures weren't merely military stopgaps. They represented a silent revolution in logistics and shelter. Consider this. World War II wasn't won solely with ammunition and armor. It was won with supply chains, infrastructure, and the capability to keep men nourished, protected, and combat-ready. The Germans had their fortified positions. The Japanese had their underground networks. But the Americans? They possessed a portable, transportable, virtually indestructible structure that could be shipped flat, erected by a handful of personnel, and withstand a typhoon. That's the kind of advantage that rarely appears in Hollywood war films, but it made a critical difference. And if you're thinking, all right, but a hut is just a hut, here's why you should stay tuned. These things didn't vanish when the war concluded. After 1945, they became woven into American society. College housing, places of worship, restaurants, even accommodations for returning veterans under the GI Bill. Some remain standing today, weathered but defiant reminders of an era when the U.S. was manufacturing war materials at a pace the world had never witnessed. So in this video, we're exploring how the Quonset Hut came to be, how it proliferated across the globe like wildfire, what life was actually like inside one, and how something engineered to be temporary became a permanent mark on history. It's a tale about steel, determination, and pure American resourcefulness. And believe me, you'll never view a semicircle the same way.
By late 1941, America confronted a logistical catastrophe. The Pearl Harbor attack thrust the U.S. into a worldwide conflict that would require forces in every corner of the earth. Millions of personnel were about to deploy, and every single one required sustenance, water, and shelter overhead. But the challenge was obvious. How do you provide housing for a constantly mobile army? Conventional wooden barracks required excessive construction time, and transporting heavy building materials across the world was impossible. The military required something revolutionary, something rapid, economical, portable, and resilient enough to handle everything from Arctic conditions to tropical downpours. This urgency transcended mere comfort. Soldiers fighting in North Africa, on isolated Pacific islands, or in freezing Alaskan positions couldn't afford to be compromised by environmental exposure. A sick or depleted soldier wasn't just one casualty. It was a rupture in the chain of warfare. American strategists understood they needed to solve the shelter dilemma before it spiraled into lost engagements. The question wasn't whether they'd devise a solution, it was how rapidly they could implement it. And this is where the Navy entered. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy recognized it would require portable housing for its expanding installations. They didn't want cumbersome tents that shredded in wind. They didn't want wooden structures that decayed in jungle humidity. They wanted a building you could package, transport anywhere, and secure together with minimal equipment. The kind of structure sailors and troops could raise in hours, not weeks. At that time, the U.S. military had experimented with something called the Nissen hut, a British design from World War I, invented in 1916 by Major Peter Nissen. It was also a curved steel structure, and the British had deployed them in France. But American planners determined it wasn't quite suitable. They wanted something simpler, more robust, and better adapted to mass production in American manufacturing plants. In other words, a distinctly American version. And this brings Quonset Point, Rhode Island, into the narrative. That's where the Navy commissioned the initial prototype of what would soon be called the Quonset Hut. The timing couldn't have been more critical. With the nation mobilizing for total war in 1941, the race began to build not just weaponry and vessels, but an entire portable infrastructure to house the men who would fight. So by the time American soldiers started deploying in early 1942, the foundation for their future accommodations had already been established. What appeared to be a simple curved shell was actually the solution to one of the most significant logistical challenges of World War II. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't showy, but without it, thousands of men would have been left vulnerable in the field, exposed not just to enemy action, but to the brutal punishment of climate and terrain. This wasn't just about construction, it was about survival. And America was about to demonstrate that solving problems like these, rapidly and at scale, was one of its greatest wartime advantages.
When the Navy issued the call in 1941 for a revolutionary building type, the assignment landed with architects and engineers at George A. Fuller Company, working at the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island. The objective was straightforward on paper, but massive in execution. Create a structure that was lightweight, inexpensive, flat-packable, and simple enough for inexperienced personnel to assemble with only fundamental tools. It needed to be durable enough to endure tropical heat, Arctic temperatures, and everything between. The design they developed was ingeniously simple. Picture a semicircle constructed from corrugated steel panels arched into a 16 by 36-foot structure. The half-moon shape wasn't merely aesthetic, it provided the hut extraordinary strength, allowing wind, precipitation, and snow to slide directly off. At each end, plywood sections could be fitted with entrances, windows, or ventilation, depending on climate and function. Inside, the huts could be insulated or left bare. The entire thing mounted on a basic wooden or concrete base, depending on the location. The initial prototypes were constructed at Quonset Point in mid-1941, which is how the huts received their name. They weren't fancy, they weren't luxurious, but they were precisely what the Navy required. They could be packed into crates compact enough to fit on vessels and aircraft, transported thousands of miles, and then secured together on location. A team of 6 to 8 personnel could raise one in a single day. Compare that to weeks of traditional barracks construction, and you understand why the Quonset Hut was an immediate success. The initial design wasn't flawless, though. The first huts had a 16-foot width, but this proved too confined for many applications.
Shortly after, engineers expanded the design to 20 feet and eventually to 40-foot wide versions. Variations quickly emerged for everything from sleeping quarters to dining facilities, offices, medical stations, and even chapels. The modular design meant you could connect huts together, extend them, or adapt them instantly. That versatility was invaluable in combat zones where requirements shifted overnight. By late 1941, the Navy had already placed enormous orders. The design was finalized, and factories began stamping corrugated steel panels by the ton. The Quonset Hut was officially rolling off production lines even as America was still recovering from Pearl Harbor. By the time U.S. forces were landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the huts were already there, waiting to shelter them. It's easy to look back now and view the Quonset Hut as inevitable, but it really wasn't. It was born from a specific moment of urgency, a marriage of industrial power and practical engineering. Without Quonset Point, without that Navy directive, without the swift work of those engineers, the war might have looked drastically different in the Pacific and beyond. The brilliance of the Quonset Hut was its simplicity. Steel arches, plywood ends, and a guarantee. No matter where you deployed American troops, they'd have a place to call home, even if just for a night.
Once the design was finalized in 1941, the United States didn't just build Quonset huts, they manufactured them in quantities that defied imagination. America's industrial capacity was already mobilizing to produce Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers. Adding a hut to the roster seemed minor in comparison, but it became one of the most prolific wartime products of all. By 1945, over 100,000 Quonset huts had emerged from factories, enough to house entire armies. How did they accomplish it? The secret was the same formula that powered American wartime industry: mass production. Factories nationwide were retooled to stamp corrugated steel sheets, cut plywood panels, and package kits containing every nut, bolt, and instruction required. Each hut was shipped as a flat-pack kit weighing approximately 5 tons. It could be loaded into a Liberty ship's hold alongside jeeps, rations, and ammunition, then offloaded anywhere globally. The Fuller Company and other contractors didn't waste time with complicated blueprints. Every hut was standardized, meaning workers could build them like automobiles on an assembly line. The dimensions were predictable, the components interchangeable, and the instructions straightforward. A box of Quonset Hut parts was like a massive construction set for adults, except these pieces built the infrastructure of a global war. Numbers tell the story best. In 1942, the Navy ordered over 25,000 huts almost immediately, and production only intensified from there. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and later across the Midwest operated around the clock. By 1943, entire ships departed American ports carrying nothing but Quonset Hut kits and the personnel trained to assemble them. The pace was so relentless that huts were often manufactured faster than the military could determine exactly where they'd go. But the real miracle was how few personnel it required to raise one. 6 or 8 soldiers with wrenches and hammers could erect a hut in under a day. No cranes, no skilled carpenters, no engineers on site, just manpower and a box of components. That speed meant newly captured islands could transform into operational bases almost overnight. Airstrips suddenly had barracks for pilots, kitchens for dining facilities, and offices for command centers. A bare patch of jungle could become a mini-city in under a week. It's worth comparing this to the opposition. While German forces were digging into bunkers and Japanese garrisons were burrowing into caves, American forces were constructing steel settlements that rose almost instantly. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant that wherever the U.S. flag landed, a functional base followed immediately behind.
By war's end, production figures rivaled some of the largest hardware programs of the conflict. Quonset huts weren't just housing, they were a symbol of America's ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outbuild their adversaries. It was one thing to deploy soldiers overseas, it was entirely another to provide them with a ready-made home, waiting in a crate wherever they landed.
Living inside a Quonset hut was unlike anything most American soldiers had ever encountered. For many, it was their first time away from home, and suddenly their dwelling was a curved shell of corrugated steel planted on foreign soil. These huts were no luxury accommodations, but compared to sleeping in a tent that leaked rain and froze at night, they were a blessing. The interiors could be customized depending on the theater of war. In the South Pacific, the huts were often insulated to counter the unrelenting heat, and screens were installed to block swarms of mosquitoes. In colder climates, think Alaska or Northern Europe, stoves were installed, sometimes one at each end, to combat the chill. Wooden floors kept personnel off the mud, and improvised dividers provided a hint of privacy. Still, most soldiers remembered them as noisy, echoing, and often sweltering during daytime. But here's the thing, Quonset huts weren't just barracks. Their versatility made them into whatever the military required at the moment. Some became dining facilities where hundreds lined up for rations. Others were transformed into field hospitals with rows of cots and the scent of antiseptic in the air. There were huts used as chapels with crude altars built under the curved roof where soldiers sang hymns thousands of miles from home. Command posts, storage facilities, classrooms, even theaters for makeshift movie screenings. If it needed a roof, a Quonset hut could fulfill the role. A soldier arriving on an island like Guadalcanal in 1943 would have witnessed a sprawl of huts rising almost overnight, turning a raw patch of jungle into a functional military installation. The huts provided a strange sense of permanence in places that were otherwise alien and hostile. They were symbols of American resourcefulness, proof that no matter where you were deployed, some slice of structure and order followed. Of course, there were drawbacks. The steel walls amplified the pounding of rain until it was deafening. In the tropics, the interior could feel like a furnace. Ventilation was often inadequate, and humidity could warp the wooden ends. But soldiers adapted, rigging makeshift fans, cutting additional windows, and doing whatever necessary to make the huts livable. After all, compared to foxholes or open-air tents, this was still an improvement. Letters home from GIs often mentioned the huts, sometimes with humor, sometimes with complaints, but almost always with appreciation that there was something between them and the elements. In the words of one Marine stationed in the Pacific, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out. That's all a man can ask for." And perhaps most importantly, the huts offered a strange sense of normalcy. You could hang your gear on a nail, line up your cot, and know that at least for the night, you weren't at the mercy of the jungle or the desert. For a soldier far from home, that small comfort was worth more than gold.
The Quonset hut didn't just remain in American installations. It proliferated like wildfire across the globe, following the advance of U.S. forces wherever they deployed. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea, these half-moon shelters became part of World War II's landscape. No matter how isolated the location, odds were good that you'd find a cluster of huts forming the backbone of a base. In the Pacific, they were indispensable. When U.S. Marines landed on Tarawa in 1943 or on Iwo Jima in early 1945, establishing a foothold wasn't just about securing ground, it was about building infrastructure. Quonset huts provided that instantly. Airfields required control towers, radio rooms, weather stations, and maintenance facilities. Instead of waiting weeks for construction, Crates were opened, steel arches were secured, and within days, a bare island bristled with buildings. Some Pacific bases ended up with hundreds of huts, arranged like a small town, complete with roads and signage. In Europe, they were equally critical. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, Quonset huts followed immediately behind. They appeared in Normandy as makeshift hospitals for the wounded, offices for logistics teams, and barracks for engineers. By the time winter struck the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, Quonset huts were being deployed as heated shelters, giving troops a respite from the freezing Belgian forests. But perhaps the most surprising deployments were in extreme climates. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, huts were constructed to withstand hurricane-force winds and bitter cold. In North Africa, they were planted in dusty camps under blazing sun, where their curved steel roofs reflected heat away better than canvas tents ever could. In every environment, the same principle applied. A flat-pack building could be transported and erected faster than any traditional construction. The global footprint was staggering. By 1945, there were Quonset huts on every continent except Antarctica. Soldiers joked that you could identify where Americans had been by spotting those steel semicircles on the horizon. They became symbols of U.S. military presence, instantly recognizable even to civilians who had never encountered them before. And it wasn't just Americans who used them. Allied nations received Quonset huts through Lend-Lease programs, establishing them in Britain, Australia, and even the Soviet Union. They were universal because they worked, and because no other nation had solved the problem of mobile housing at such scale. The huts became so commonplace that many soldiers assumed they'd endure forever. They transformed barren islands into functioning cities, carved order from chaos, and gave troops the infrastructure to continue fighting thousands of miles from home. If war is about logistics, then the Quonset hut was one of America's most unsung weapons. By war's end, it didn't matter if you were on a Pacific atoll, a French farmyard, or an Arctic outpost, you'd see the same curved roofs standing against the sky. They were proof that America hadn't just deployed personnel overseas, it had transported an entire civilization with them.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most people anticipated the Quonset hut would fade away with the war. After all, these steel arches were intended to be temporary, a quick solution for an urgent crisis. But that's not what occurred. Instead, they began a second existence, one that would shape post-war America in ways nobody could have predicted. First, there was the immediate challenge. What to do with all those huts? With over 100,000 manufactured, the U.S. military suddenly possessed a massive surplus. Many were dismantled and sold as scrap, but thousands more were transported back home or left standing overseas. The timing was perfect, because America was confronting its own housing crisis. Millions of GIs were returning from Europe and the Pacific, and the GI Bill was fueling a surge in college enrollments. Cities and universities required places for these men and their new families to live, and fast. Quonset huts became an immediate solution. Across the United States, colleges established entire hut villages for veterans. At the University of Michigan, for example, returning GIs and their families resided in Quonset hut communities, complete with kitchens, bedrooms, and even small yards. Other institutions like the University of Minnesota, Brown, and UCLA did the same. These villages weren't glamorous. Many wives joked about cooking in a half-cylinder kitchen, but they were affordable, rapid, and better than nothing. Beyond universities, entire communities sprouted Quonset hut neighborhoods. Some were converted into churches, diners, and even dance halls. Small businesses purchased surplus huts and transformed them into workshops, garages, and warehouses. Farmers loved them too, using the huts as barns and storage facilities.
For a generation that had just fought a war defined by scarcity, these ready-made structures felt like gifts. And they didn't just stay in America. Overseas, Quonset huts abandoned during the war were absorbed into local communities. In places like the Philippines, Guam, and even parts of Europe, people utilized them for homes, schools, and shops long after the Americans had departed. The huts that were meant to vanish after the war became landmarks of survival and recovery. Still, they weren't perfect. Families often complained of poor insulation, leaky roofs, and the constant creak of metal. Winters were brutally cold, summers sweltering hot. But for many, these huts represented stability in a chaotic post-war world. They were a stepping stone, a roof overhead, while something more permanent was constructed. The strangest part? Some huts refused to die. By the 1950s and 60s, thousands were still standing, patched with new siding, windows, or insulation. Even today, you can find original World War II Quonset huts dotting American landscapes. Some rusted and abandoned, others still in use as storage or workshops. What started as a wartime necessity ended up reshaping peacetime America. The Quonset hut became more than just a shelter. It was a bridge from the chaos of war to the promise of rebuilding. And like the soldiers who lived in them, these huts proved tougher and more enduring than anyone expected.
Even now, nearly 80 years after World War II's end, the Quonset hut has not disappeared. In fact, it has become an enduring symbol of wartime ingenuity, a reminder of how America's industrial power could solve problems on a global scale. You can still drive across parts of the United States and spot them. Semicircles of corrugated steel standing stubbornly in fields, on college campuses, or behind workshops. Some are battered and rusted, others lovingly restored, but all of them whisper the same story. Built fast, built cheap, built to last. The legacy of the Quonset hut extends beyond just nostalgia. Architects and historians often point to it as a precursor to modern prefab housing. The concept of shipping flat-pack kits and assembling them on site is something we now associate with companies like IKEA. But in 1941, America was already doing it on an industrial scale. The hut proved that modular design could be both practical and scalable, and it sparked conversations in the post-war years about solving housing shortages with mass-produced homes. For veterans, the huts carried emotional weight. Many remembered them as the backdrop of their wartime lives, the place where they wrote letters home, laughed with comrades, or collapsed into exhausted sleep after battle. For civilians, the huts became a strange but familiar sight, dotting landscapes from Rhode Island to remote Pacific atolls. They symbolized not just military power, but also the American ability to improvise and adapt. Culturally, the Quonset hut even earned a kind of iconic status. Artists painted them, filmmakers used them as backdrops, and writers referenced them as shorthand for the wartime experience. By the 1950s, they had become fixtures in American pop culture, embodying both the grit of war and the hope of rebuilding. In some towns, people still gather in community centers that were once surplus Quonset huts, their curved roofs arching over dances, meetings, and Sunday services. The story doesn't end there. In the 21st century, architects and DIY builders have rediscovered the Quonset form for eco-housing and affordable shelters. The same principles that worked in 1942, simplicity, durability, and cost efficiency,
still make sense today. Some companies even manufacture modernized Quonset-style structures for farms, workshops, and homes, proving that the original design never truly went out of style. And maybe that's the most striking legacy of all. These huts were supposed to be temporary, but like the veterans who once lived in them, they endured. They became markers of a generation's struggle and triumph, still standing as silent witnesses to the war that reshaped the world. So next time you see one of those curved steel shells standing quietly on the side of a road, remember, that humble hut helped win a world war, housed soldiers on every continent, and went on to shape post-war life in ways no one could have imagined. In its own quiet way, the Quonset hut is as much a symbol of World War II as the Jeep, the Sherman tank, or the Liberty ship. Proof that sometimes the simplest solutions leave the longest shadows.